All right, everyone. Hello, welcome. This is the NFT series on smart contracts and decentralized networks. My name is Nye Warburton, and I am the Associate Chair of the Interactive Design and Game Development Department at SCAD. This is the third talk in the series. The first came from Gene McPhillips, and then my boss chair, Sue-Ann Fu. I'm following up after on their work, but I wanted to sort of widen up a little bit. There's a lot of talk about NFTs, but I really believe that they are the tip of the iceberg. When you're talking about blockchains, there's just so much more to them than NFTs. So I wanted to kind of widen up a little bit and talk about smart contracts and decentralized networks. What do these two things mean, and how are they valuable? And hopefully by the end of today, you'll have a better understanding of what they are. While I'm giving this talk, what you might want to think about are these two things, right? On the left-hand side of your screen is what's centralized trust. So we take some money or something very valuable, things that we really care about, and we put them inside a safe or in a bank or behind walls or put guards around them or put lots of cryptography. That's how we've basically been building most of our trust networks up until this point. We're now migrating globally into a world of decentralized trust, particularly with networks, computer networks. So if you imagine a bunch of computers around the world talking to each other, all coming to what's called consensus, this is how we are sort of migrating. So think about these two images and keep it in your head as I work through this presentation. So I'm going to start off by saying who I am, just so you can determine whether or not you want to trust me. And then we're going to go through this idea of trust. And I'm going to propose to you a framework, a method for us to evaluate trust. And then we're going to use that framework to evaluate money, as in the American dollar, blockchain, specifically the Bitcoin network, and then also this idea of smart contracts for the Ethereum network. And then after sort of a quick review of understanding that trust, we're going to go into this concept of decentralization. What does that mean, decentralization? Like philosophically, what does that mean? And then we're going to do some examples of decentralized networks. These are actual functional working examples of blockchain networks that are tokenizing their user base. And then we're going to talk about this concept of governance. How does a network govern itself? And then what is the future of these networks? Are they going to take hold? Is this all speculative nonsense? Like what's the future? And at the very end, I'm just going to do a couple of pointers on how to get started with Web3. So let's get into it. I'd be amiss if I didn't have the elephant in the room, talk about the elephant in the room, which is Bitcoin crashed on Wednesday. Well, crashed somewhat. It went below $30,000, let's say that. And so I'm aware that this is a speculative asset, and there's a lot of hearsay about what Bitcoin really is. But conversely, if you see on the right-hand side, this is Bitcoin over 5 years, which is gained 1,589%. So yes, it's down, but it's also up. So this encapsulates a lot of what I'll be talking about today with these networks. So first of all, who am I? So good morning. That's how you say hello in the Web3 space, GM. My name is Professor Nye. That's what my students call me. I kind of like it. And I teach creatives to build for what's coming. So I was an animator and a computer graphics artist for 20 years at a number of the companies that you see here. I was a character animator at Sony ImageWorks and Electronic Arts. And then I worked in pre-visualization and visualization and virtual production in companies like the Third Floor and Digital Domain. And then did contracting and startup work with Disney Imagineering, Cedars-Sinai, a whole bunch of companies. And then one day I was on a motion capture stage. And if you don't know what a motion capture stage is, look at the behind the scenes for Avatar or what have you, and you see people walking around a stage with these fancy suits on, and their data is being captured into a engine or a 3D package. I was building a pipeline, and one of the vendors was doing a facial capture system, and I was asking some questions, and the vendor said, wait, before you export the data, you need to train the model. And I remember that stuck with me, that stuck in my brain, and I realized that it's already here. Artificial intelligence was already in the pipeline, and it hit me like a ton of bricks. I went right back to my computer and I Googled machine learning for the first time, and I have been on a downward slide. I've been going down the rabbit hole with networks and creative data, and that also includes Blockchains. Blockchains are a very big deal, and I think creatives should learn how to use them and embrace them and be very aware of what's happening with them. So all of this is based on research that I've read before, right? So Kevin Werbach from the University of Pennsylvania, Wharton School of Business, Blockchain, New Architecture of Trust, The Truth Machine by Vigna and Casey. They are MIT lab researchers. Yochai Bentler is Harvard. Post-capitalism, Paul Mason and Pete Drucker. It's this concept that we're moving into sort of a knowledge economy as opposed to an industrial economy. And then lots of blogs and lots of Twitter. I spend a lot of time on the internet just consuming as much as I possibly can. All right, so let's get into it. Let's start with this concept of trust. And particularly, I'm going to call pointers to three particular things. One, in trust, there is a framework. That's sort of a technical framework, and then there's a backing. Something has to have its back, and then there's a belief, right? So when you go down to Bull Street Taco and you order some tacos, and then you give that waiter or the person behind the register your card or a $20 bill, why do you trust them? Why do you not think that they're going to go outside and Ferris Bueller you and jump into a car and drive away with your money? It's because there's some sort of mechanism of trust that's in your brain at that point. And I'm going to argue that these three components are a necessary component for trust to be able to work. And this is the key formula for creating something like money or eventually smart contracts. So let's start with money, right? A lot of you keep money in your pockets. You have these little pieces of paper that have these little green pictures on them and little codes and pictures of presidents. You believe that this has value. You stress if your bank account is crashing, or you get excited when you jackpot. Why? What is it about this thing that makes you trust it? So I'm going to start in the Renaissance because for many years human beings would go along and they weren't really doing anything terribly interesting. They were working in the fields, sort of subsistence farming, and then they would go at night and they would eat gruel and stare at the fire. But then all of a sudden in the 1400s and the 1500s, we had this cognitive explosion of philosophy and art, and we were thinking about these really complex ideas and doing music and architecture and all of this crazy stuff. And there's a variety of reasons why this might have happened, but one of the really good ones is there was a technology that came onto the scene, which was the printing press. So by 1500, which was sort of close to the start of the height of the Renaissance, 282 cities in Europe had the printing press, which meant that there were hundreds of thousands of volumes of knowledge that were circulating around. So if I was a bricklayer or an architect or a painter, I didn't have to make anything up from scratch. I could just kind of go and I could read what's come before. And there was this explosion in philosophy and literature and ethics, and mathematics were coming in from the Middle East. That was really crucial, right? We had math for the first time, like really, in Europe. And it came rise to this sort of merchant capitalism. And the reason why is when you increase knowledge, when a society increases knowledge, it's a means to productivity. A lot of economists will agree that the more knowledge a society will have, the more productive they are. So the question is, how do you capture that productivity? How do you capture that productivity value? So there was this framework that was kind of used a little bit, but it became standardized by the Medici banking clan. So the Medicis were sort of the venture capitalists of the Renaissance era. And they took this bookkeeping method where they took debit and credit, and they put it in two different columns, and so they could track the money coming in and the money going out. And this also allowed them to do some fancy things, like they could, lend money to somebody and then they could, charge interest on it, or they could create different sort of financial assets from it. So this became the standard for accounting and modern day banking. And even though we have all these fancy computers and all that sort of stuff, we still are maintaining these dual entry ledgers. If you think about it, every company keeps books. Each bank keeps books. So it doesn't matter if you swipe your card with Visa or you're in Bank of America, everybody is maintaining different ledgers and they're all making sure that these books are copacetic, right? They're checking all of the books. So this method, this dual entry ledger bookkeeping is still a practical way of doing banking. So the framework or the backing is, we used to back by gold. And this has sort of systematically been unplugged by a number of presidents. FDR, Nixon come to mind, but we now back by the Fed. Essentially, we're saying the Fed says that your money is okay. And so when you go to a bank, you'll see FDIC, and we'll also see big safes and lots of ID codes and various kind of imageries. But we are reinforced that our money is okay because it is backed by the Fed. So then I also want to go to Texas, right, which gives this example of belief. It's become kind of this textbook example. So the Republic of Texas went independent from Mexico in the mid-1830s. So Texas formed its own republic, and in order to promise to its people, it created the redback, which is sort of a promissory note, became its currency. And this currency was used for a little while, but then it started to, crash. And the common consensus was that people were more interested in joining the American Union than they were in Texas. And so the belief in the currency crashed. So when you don't believe in the thing that the currency represents, if the currency does not represent something that actually has the sustained belief of its users, then it can't operate. And this is the last and most important mechanism of trust, right? So I'd be amiss if I didn't mention the 2008 financial crisis, because all three of those things, the framework, the backing, and the belief, were all basically blown to smithereens. The Lehman Brothers, they cooked the books, they swapped out their books for all those subprime mortgages, and it caused a huge trust issue that caused a run on the banks, and we had a huge financial crisis. And our world, potentially, our economy, global economy, could have crashed, but they were too big to fail, and the government bailed them out. All of our tax dollars bailed them out, and that was crucial in order to maintain the backing, but also the belief in the economic system that we had developed. So the framework, this accounting, this dual entry ledger, the modern underpinnings of banking, it's backed by, it used to be gold, but now this proof of Fed, right? And then the belief is that this is the United States of America. And the American dollar is the global reserve currency. We to this day, sure, there's a lot of debt and a lot of inflation that's happening, but we still are the global reserve currency for this reason. Okay, so can we take this framework that we've just developed and apply it to the blockchain? And what is the blockchain? So let's get into that. So the 2008 crisis was really a big deal, especially to a group of people called these cypherpunks. And this is a movement that has been growing in the Bay Area since the 1970s. And it was a collection of these kind of hippie programmer and cryptographers who tended to skew very libertarian and in some cases anarchistic. And they were committed to online digital privacy. And so this movement had been going on for a while, and a lot of forums and a lot of discussions and a lot of research all came from these hackers, essentially. And I want to make note for a few of them here. In 1998, one of them named Wide Day came up with this concept of B-money, which is sort of a digital money that could be used as an alternative to fiat currency. And then Hal Finney in 2004 came up with this concept of proof of work, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. And then Nick Szabo in 2005 came up with this idea called BitGold. And Nick Szabo was actually really big. He came up with the term smart contracts in the 1990s. So I'm about to talk about some of these concepts in terms of the blockchain, but a lot of these concepts have been growing for 30 years in this cypherpunk movement. And in 2009 on the metsdao.com forum, a shadowy figure came about, Satoshi Nakamoto, and he put a paper up for the Bitcoin network. Now, a lot of people think that it was a collection or maybe some of these cypherpunks, but it's too uncanny that the fact that they were already talking about a lot of these ideas and they were crystallized together into this one kind of like anonymous figure. So what the proposal said is, that dual entry ledger, those Satoshi Nakamoto put them into these bits of code called blocks. And each of these blocks had hashes which were addresses to the previous block. So they were effectively chained one after another. So each of these blocks contained the transactions. And it created an immutable network token ledger, which means that they could track the debit and the credit of the token as it came in and out of the system, and it was chained on these blocks. The real innovation, though, was as opposed to Lehman Brothers, swapping out their books and hiding their books, the ledger was exposed to everybody. It was clearly available to everyone on the network, and only if everybody on the network agreed would the ledger be updated. This was called consensus, and this is the critical term in blockchain. In any sort of architecture for blockchain, consensus is what you're trying to get to. How do you get the entire network to agree? And this is crucial when we talk about governance in a little bit. The backing part was a little bit complicated, and it's sort of a little over my head, but there was this concept of proof of work, which was an energy-intensive computational validation. There were these big, really powerful machines on the network that would crunch massive amounts of these computational operations and do this sort of network lottery of sort, where these computers would be paid out in Bitcoin. And this was called mining, right? So the computers would mine the network and they would create the backing, the validation for the transactions. And then the belief in the network, right? So, in the early days of Bitcoin, one guy went to Papa John's and said, hey, I want to buy a couple of pizzas. And Papa John's like, I've never heard of this Bitcoin thing. He went to the forums and said, hey, I want to spend some Bitcoin on pizzas. And the network said, hey, this is really funny and cool. And they wound up making some liquidity and they made the transaction happen. So everybody who was using Bitcoin at that time realized that the amount that he'd spent was worth 2 pieces. And that jump-started the network. And as of December 21st, Bitcoin was worth about $46,000. Last week, it just dipped below 30. There's speculation whether it's going to go up or down. No one really knows. In fact, the guy on the left, Bill Miller, says 50% of his holdings is in Bitcoin, whereas Warren Buffett calls it rat poison. So this speculative asset is still very much in use, and it is the underpinning and the granddaddy of all of the blockchain networks because of it. So the framework, we have an immutable network ledger, right? An exposed ledger that everybody can see and everybody can come to consensus. The backing is this proof of work, this mining operation, and the belief is that we now have digital, decentralized money, Bitcoin. Very, very big deal. Okay, so what does this mean for these smart contracts? What are these smart contracts things? Well, let's talk about real contracts first. So we have these legal contracts, which are the underpinning of our day-to-day society. So I own my house, right? So I've got a title to my house or a deed to my house. I own my car. I have to have licenses to drive my car. I need an ID at SCAD. I have my social security. I have my passport. These are all contracts. These are all documents that have been legally validated by centralized agencies, right? So also partnership. My wife and I are married. We can legally joint file on our taxes. I can create partnerships with people. I can say 50-50 or 70-30. Or a group of people can come together and they say, hey, here's an intellectual property or an idea. Let's create an LLC and deploy some shares. And we'll get some founding shares and there'll be some voting shares and then maybe we'll have shares for public. So if we want to raise money on like a stock market or something. So all of these are contracts. All of these are legal documents that help us run our day-to-day society. And at the very highest level, there's this governance idea, right? So we elect representatives, people who we delegate these representatives. So in the 1700s, some of these really smart guys went into a room in Philadelphia and were like, you know what, we don't like this king thing. We don't like this centralized executive idea. We pay taxes. We want representation. And so they decided to come up with a series of documents, legal documents, that will allow them to democratize, to distribute the power amongst this tiered system. And so now we have, governance. We have representatives and senators and the executive office for the president and the legislator and all these components that we used are all in documents. So as it turns out, this Canadian genius named Vitalik Buterin thought of this idea of these contracts, these legal contracts, and then also knew about what was happening in the Bitcoin space with these blocks and these chains, these hashed blocks together. And he thought, well, instead of having the ledger, the dual ledger, what if we put contracts in there, immutable network contracts into the blockchain? And that's what he did, and he created Ethereum. So the framework is an immutable programmable ledger. So Ethereum, these smart contracts, as they're called, can be programmed. So if you and I decide that we're going to paint a fence and we're going to split it 50-50, we can put it into a contract that says that that payment won't be executed unless both of us execute our side of it. Or maybe we could program it that, if one of us finishes it, they get 50%. It's sort of like an if-then statement. It only executes if things are true. So the backing is still this proof of work thing, which is kind of a bummer because proof of work really does take a lot of energy. And then the belief is that you have these legalized, decentralized documents, which are called smart contracts. So, like lawyer contracts, there's boilerplates. So we have, statement of works or, LLC, approved contracts that lawyers use again and again, or language they use again and again. Well, same kind of thing about these smart contracts. Since it's open source, these software developers developed these smart contracts. One of the early standards was this ERC-20, and that was the tokenization. It was sort of like a way to white label your own token. And there were different functions within it that allowed you to deploy an infinite amount or a limited amount or create a bonding curve to be able to deploy your own token. And that's what happened in the 2017 range or so. There were lots and lots of startups that deployed their own token. Most of them were garbage and they went nowhere, but this is the reason. It's because for the first time you were able to create your first blockchain token. The ERC 721 came about when some people thought these tokens don't have enough utility in that I have multiple things, like a Spider-Man comic number 1 is more valuable than Spider-Man comic number 5, right? So there is a fungibility. So they created a non-fungible token, which was the ERC 721. And this last class here actually was developed by gamers, the ERC 1155, where they said, well, let's create these asset classes where we collect some of these tokens and non-fungibles together and we can build things. So if you think about like a Lego box, like let's say it's a Lego car or something, the individual pieces might be ERC 721, but the collection, the assembly might be an ERC 1155, right? So these alone have accounted for an explosion, a massive explosion in value in blockchains. One of the things they allowed to do is they could create, users could have wallets, and then they can exchange tokens. So user 1 wallet could exchange an ERC-20 with user 2, or user 2 could sell his cat picture to user 1. That you are exchanging assets back and forth, and this is the beginning of what's called decentralized finance, or DeFi. This has grown extraordinarily fast, and we're now in the phases where we're using these things called multi-signatures. So let's say there's a cat ERC 721 NFT. You could put a multi-signature that has multiple users could have ownership or put in different amounts of tokens. This creates really complex infrastructures, things like companies, and which is what we're kind of moving into in the blockchain space. So with these contracts alone, you can do an awful lot. So let's review. I'm going to stop right here and review a little bit before we move into decentralization, because I want to review this framework and get it in your brain. So money, it's a dual entry ledger. It's backed by the Federal Reserve, and we have this belief in fiat currency. It's essentially currency that is printed, right? It's not backed by gold or anything like that. That's what most of the planet is running on right now. Bitcoin is a framework for a network ledger, an immutable network ledger that has consensus. The backing is proof of work, which is this high-end mechanism of computational validation. And then we have decentralized money because of it. Now, money and Bitcoin are a storage of value, which is why I'm skeptical on things like Bitcoin, because it's all of a speculative asset. But Ethereum is a validation of a deal. It's a programmable ledger, it's proof of work, and it's smart contracts. So if you and I make a deal, we take out a piece of paper and we say, I agree to do this and you agree to do this, and we both sign off on that, that contract still has value, right? The Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, it's just a piece of paper, but it has value. It still can work, right? So then validating that deal on a network and making it executable by smart contracts, I think is extraordinarily interesting and extraordinarily valuable, because it's not just a currency, it's a way of executing a platform that creates deals. So let's talk about this concept now of decentralization. Why would you decentralize? Why don't I just go to a lawyer and set up a company? Why don't I just do this all through LegalZoom or something like that, right? Why do I think about, okay, what is the value of decentralization? And to do that, I'm going to use a couple of examples that are not crypto before we go into the crypto examples. So for a long time in the 20th century, we put all of our accumulated knowledge, or at least sort of the best part accumulated knowledge, and we put them into these books. And Britannica was a company that aggregated it. The Encyclopedia Britannica was a series of volumes that had, by A, B, C, D, listed all of the notes about India and, Lego and beer and whatever else we wanted to know about. We can look it up, chemistry or something, and they would deploy a new version of the Britannica every year. There was one entity writing it, editing it, licensing the images, doing the sales, printing it, all of that. That all came from a centralized entity, which was Britannica. When the internet came about, there was an alternate that was Wikipedia. Now, Wikipedia was this website that was free, that everyone could use, and we are now all collectively editing Wikipedia. There's these single entries that we can go in, and I can learn about machine learning or Paris Hilton or history or any of these things because it's constantly updating, it's constantly dynamic. I want you to think for a second if a centralized company, that is a company that holds a bunch of information on its servers like Amazon, tried to do what Wikipedia is doing. They would have to hire engineers, they would have to hire developers, they would have to hire writers and images. They could not create the same kind of value as a global planet working collectively on a decentralized encyclopedia. And that's why it is so powerful. The problem, if you noticed, if you've been to Wikipedia lately, is that they don't have any money. They're constantly asking for donations in order to keep going. I'm going to bring up this other example. This is Blender. Blender is a 3D package, but it's also open source. So I can go in here and create computer graphics that would be great for visual effects or game development or any number of things. But as opposed to sort of centralized or licensed properties like Autodesk, which does Maya, or Houdini or something like that, I can take the source code of Blender and I can modify it. That means if I don't like something that's in the package, I don't like a button, I don't like the way it renders or it does something like that, I can take that code and I can change it. And I can propose a new change to this source code. And if people in the community like that I've made this change, then it could potentially be migrated or merged into the master branch and go into the software itself. So on Autodesk, on the Maya side, I have to wait for the company to make the decision that the community wants an update. But in Blender, in the open source, I can participate, I can actively participate in the community and the development of it, which means that the community has more ownership of it. Again, not really a lot of ways to make money on this. Sure, you could sell add-ons or things like that. For the most part, people are donating their time to this open source commitment. There's this book called The Wealth of Networks by, he was at Yale, but now he's at law at Harvard, Yochai Bentler, and he came up with this idea of common-based peer production, which was a model of socioeconomic production where a large number of people work cooperatively, usually over the internet. Effectively, he's talking about Wikipedia and the like. Android is another example. Android is an open source software where lots and lots of people work on it collectively, and the productivity gains that you get outperform essentially the centralized versions thousands and thousands to one. So this is an interesting model of production where you can create a huge collective entity to build. So the problem is we don't have an economic system that pays for it, right? So the question is, could we pay all of those Wikipedia entries? Could we pay open source? Could we use this collective production and pay them to be able to incentivize them and catalyze the network? Too good to be true? Let me introduce you to Filecoin. So Filecoin is that ERC20 standard from Ethereum that incentivizes nodes to be able to optimize computers to create space. So I can go home and I can fire up my computer and I can donate 10 megabytes or 100 megabytes or a gigabyte of space, and it will collectively be incorporated into the IPFS, the Interplanetary File System. This is the permanent web. This is the collective storage of the permanent web. And since it's all cryptographically secure, it's not saving individual files. It's sort of like this crypto hash that can't be read. So this globular data is being distributed across the planet. And the amount of space in the 2 years of this existence is already outperforming Amazon and Microsoft. As a result, it's becoming the back end, the database of the decentralized web. Anybody who's actually collecting NFTs, your CryptoKitty or your CryptoPunk or your Bored Ape, the image itself is probably hosted on IPFS or one of its competitors, because this is how you store decentralized value without any true ownership. Microsoft or Amazon does not own it. It's collectively owned on the IPFS. Don't get it? Okay, let's try another one. This is called Helium. I really love this project. It's not very old. As you can see, as of November, there's only 90,000 active nodes. It's not really active in places like Georgia, but in San Francisco and Barcelona, where they're a little bit more techy, it is. If you think about centralized Wi-Fi networks like AT&T or Verizon, they need very large towers in order to set this up. You can buy these little doodads for the Helium network, and you can host your own hotspot, which means that you can get paid in Helium if people use your hotspot on your Wi-Fi. And this has gained a lot of venture capital funding. It started to gain traction. Still not a lot, but for a year of active use and the fact that it's actually working, it's still very impressive. Also, these little hardware things are open source. I could build my own if I knew how to do it. So a very, very fascinating project built on top of the Ethereum ecosystem. Hive Mapper. So this is brand new, just a few weeks old. Barely a few weeks old. And Hive Mapper is, so Google goes around and it maps the entire world. In fact, if you go on Google Maps, you'll probably find your house, your neighborhood, where you went to school, potentially the license of your car. Google is going around mapping the world. Well, Hive Mapper is like, don't you think we should own that data? So they created, again, these little hardware things that you're going to fix to your car and go around, and as you map the world, you are paid in honey. This is a brand new project. I don't know how it's going. It's gained a lot of venture capital traction. But what I love about it, it's built on top of a Helium. You can't map unless you have a Wi-Fi network to map on top of. And Helium is built on top of Ethereum. So this whole ecosystem, the hardware, the software, the smart contracts, everything is all open source. It's all moddable, which allows multiple creative entities to be able to come in and create new kinds of value in lots of different ways. I think it's very, very exciting. This is a Render Token and Golem. These are both tokens that you can donate your processing power. So you can go home and I can contribute to the Render network, and I can get paid in Render Token. This has been live for about 3 weeks now, and you'll see John Knoll, graphics pioneer from Industrial Light and Magic fame, the guy who invented Photoshop, did the first commercial job as of 2 weeks ago on the Render network, which means actual companies are using this network to render. The Golem network is a little bit more technically advanced. As a result, their user experience, the software they're using to be able to get into it is a little bit more technical, but they've been focusing heavily on that open source stack, the Blenders and the Godot's of the world. And you'll see to use a $59.50 for a full day costs less than $8. So already there is a price mechanism that allows people, the value is that you can render for a lot cheaper. So this are both projects that are very interesting to watch. This one is Gitcoin. So remember how I talked about those open source projects? What if you could get paid? Well, this is based off of the GitHub or the Git mindset. All of these projects are using various forms of decentralized finance to get to fund them. You can see one of them is 132,000, one of them is 86,000 or 88,000, 41,000. This has only been active for a little while, and already a number of projects are gaining successfully across the finish line. So time will tell if something like Android, could you imagine if Android set up some sort of funding mechanism or a coin? It's already being used by a global user base of I think 9,000 developers are on Android or something. Imagine if people were being paid for it, what you could do with that kind of incentivization. This also works for character brands, right? So instead of a token, you're not deploying a token, you're deploying an NFT that has been scrambled. So the Bored Ape or the Meebits or the Nouns, you can deploy a limited number or an infinite number of NFTs to your community and then give them intellectual property rights to be able to build on top of it. And then the network together increasingly gains in value. And then the rarity traits and all that kind of stuff are sort of secondary aspects, but this is a way to pull together a community. So even though you're not building a product specifically, you're building, a character or a film or some sort of intellectual property or maybe it's even a logo. You can share it with your community and build on top of it. Think of it like a network. All these pieces like a network, right? So choose your spot on the network. Choose a node somewhere on here. Think about you're talking to people through a chat app or you're sharing files. All the things that you're working back and forth with all these other people in the network. You're all collectively building. And the sun in the middle there, the sun icon, is the value that you're creating in that network. That collective value comes from that network, right? So what you do in these decentralized networks is you tokenize that. You tokenize that value, and everybody has a piece in that network. And that means that you're all feeling more incentivized to work on it, and you're also building value for yourself, kind of selfishly, as well as building it collectively for the network. It's a very interesting economic paradigm. So this is the ownership economy in 2022. I mentioned a couple of them, but there's all kinds of stuff happening in here. There's gaming, NFT marketplaces, DeFi, collections, media, all that stuff. So this is from the Variant Fund. You can check this out. All kinds of really interesting projects. Some of them are going to be huge. Some of them are probably going to shake out, but it's a very, very active space for sure. And some of these are billion-dollar properties. So I want to talk about proof of stake. So if you remember, proof of work is that kind of environmental disaster, right? I think by recent accounts, proof of work is accounting for as much energy on the Bitcoin network as all of Norway, right? And it's also extremely expensive. So if I'm going to make a transaction on the Ethereum network, I'm going to have to pay gas fees, which is to pay for network transactions to incentivize the network. And gas fees can be $60, $100, $200, $500. Gets really expensive very, very fast. So this new form of proof of stake is low energy and high transaction. What it is if I own, say, $10 of a token, I stake it in the network, right? I stake my claim to the network. Now I can gain interest on this, but it also gains access to things like proposals or voting, or I can delegate. So one of the networks is Tezos. Tezos is built on proof of delegation. That means that I can say, hey, I like that node over there. It's performing really well. I believe in what that node is doing. I'm going to delegate my stake to that. And Tezos has been able to govern itself, self-govern itself. So like the Bitcoin network had to fracture, right? So there's Bitcoin Cash and there's Bitcoin that fractured because the network couldn't come to consensus on a couple of things, right? And they argued so much that it fractured. Proof of stake mitigates those kinds of risks. And there are networks like Solana and Tezos that are potentially proving that this proof of stake mechanism, not only is it cheap, and the China transactions are like 30 cents or so, you can do a lot of really interesting things. So the last part, though, is where are we going? What is the future of some of these things? And I want to talk a little bit about my concern. Decentralization is supposed to be the promise. The fact that we can democratize this amongst a massive number of people and create value, I think, is incredibly amazing. The first point that I want to make is that we are in a very speculative and potential bubble. You're already seeing that it crashed last week because of the sort of Luna and Terra stablecoin thing, as well as the Bitcoin problems. But the total investment amount in deals, this is the internet, in 2000 was huge. And then look, it crashed and by 2002. And by early phases of 2004, that's when Mark Zuckerberg was programming his first Facebook, his beta of Facebook and launching, right? So most of the internet that we know and love happened after that crash. So a lot of this speculation and a lot of this NFT bubble has to shake out first. So that's the first point. The second point is if you analyze the ownership of these networks, a few number of wallets control most of the tokens. So venture capitalists or Chinese firms or whoever it is are owning large percentage of the networks. That means if a small group of people are controlling it, it's not really that decentralized, which means that we're not really moving in a direction that's kind of like what Yochai Bentler is speculating. We're kind of using a small number of people to manage these networks, and that's a little concerning. The shakeout is that we're developing sort of a centralized web and a decentralized web, and something that's kind of in between, like a web 2.5 or 2.2 or something. So the centralized web, yes, is Meta and Twitter and Shopify. They're all integrating NFTs. Meta is announcing 50%. They're taking 50% transaction fees on anything they interact on Web3. So, they're banking that their user base is not going to want to learn how to set up a wallet, and they're going to charge them hefty for it. Now, I know OpenSea and Coinbase and Magic Eden, you think, okay, these are decentralized companies, but they're not. They're centralized companies that are interfacing with the decentralized web, which means that they're building these platforms to be able to take advantage of the decentralized web, but they're still charging these fees. I think OpenSea is like 2.5. The decentralized web, Bitcoin and Ethereum, they're probably not going to go anywhere. They're going to continue to be stores of value. But I think that Binance and Solana and Tezos, these are going to be the transactional. So if I'm just doing a lot of transactions, think about playing a video game. You're going to have to do hundreds or if not thousands of transactions to be able to change things out and move things around. So you're going to have to move a lot of currency around. So these new chains are going to become ways for companies to be able to interface, do all the stuff they need to do to be able to change between chains and make some transactions. So there's going to be a heavy push between these two. And we're not really going to know how it's going to shake out for a while. And this is sort of the current state of where it's at. So quick review of everything that we talked about. We talked first about trust with that framework, those three things, the framework itself, the backing, and then the belief. We talked about money, we talked about blockchain and Bitcoin specifically, and then also in smart contracts. Then we talked about this concept of decentralization and some of the decentralized networks that I think are cool, that this tokenizing, this collective productive, this common-based peer production. We talked a little bit about governance, right? And then the migration into the proof of stake, that people can control their network. But then we also talked about, are we still going back into the centralized, are we going back to the same traps that we've always been doing? I started this by talking about this image, right? We have these centralized versions of trusts where we put them into safe, or we have centralized agencies, and we have banks. We're migrating into this world where we have network consensus, globalized network consensus as our new trust mechanism. This is going to happen regardless as we move into a more and more digital world. So the question is it going to be controlled by all of us or by a few of us? If you want to get started in Web3, the first thing you need to do is sign up on the Google form in the chat. I would like to do a number of more workshops. Maybe we can mint some NFTs or learn about some of the chains in particular. I'm a big fan of Solana, so if you want to sign up for that, please, it's in the chat right now. I recommend setting up a wallet. If you want to do Ethereum, MetaMask is sort of the way to go. It's kind of industry standard. But Temple Wallet for Tezos or Phantom for Solana, those are great chains to get going, get your feet wet because they're so cheap in terms of transaction fees. So make a transaction, buy a really cheap NFT, connect your wallet to an application, find an application like Uniswap or something like that. Do a couple of those just so you get used to it. Understand what it is. Don't buy an expensive NFT. Don't buy a Bored Ape. Don't spend $10,000 of your life savings investing in crypto yet. Start small. Do your own research. Don't believe anything I say. Find out for your own. Go out there, kick the tires on some things, read some articles, build your own set of confidence. I am not giving investment advice. I am not an investor. I am a software builder. And don't invest or make anything. If you're going to do a project, an NFT project, you should make your own NFT project. Don't make something that you really care about and then throw it away, because there is a lot of rampant scams. There are a lot of ways that you can get hacked. So don't invest or make anything that you aren't willing or able to use. This is all prototyping. This is all throwaway. I still believe this is now the time to jump in. If you remember, I started this by talking about the Renaissance. I believe we're going into a digital renaissance of sorts. sorts. And this is the time absolutely to jump in. You're going to go into these companies and they're not going to know anything about Web3. And if you know just a little bit, you're really going to have a tactical advantage over a lot of your peers. That's my email at SCAD. You can find me online at nywarburton.com. I'm also very active on Twitter, even though I don't really tweet that much. I'm always there. You can DM me there. And then thank you, WAGMI. We're all going to make it. That's a Web3 phrase that we all like to say. Thank you very much for your time today. I appreciate it. And I will now take a few questions.